Hi, everybody. My name is Adam Andrick. I'm a recovered alcoholic. I picked up my first drink at around 12 or 13. Not quite sure. I'm still kind of burnt. Um, and it was 2 gallons of red wine and 5 beers, you know. And there was about, I don't know, 5 or 6 of us, and we all went down to the railroad tracks and hung out at a construction site and proceeded to get wrecked. It was most of us. It was our first experience altogether. I went to a very, very, very small Catholic school. Our graduating 9th grade class had 17 kids in it. So we all grew up together. We all did the same things for the first time together, and, like I said, this was a normal thing in my life. So I never perceived what I was doing as abnormal, until later on. I also want to say that, growing up, I was born in New Jersey, and we moved out to California when I was real young. I was about 2 years old, but the entire family was still on the East Coast. So my whole childhood was back and forth and back and forth. We never really lived back here, but we were always coming back to the East Coast. And those kind of roots that kids plant and build kind of a structure around, I never seemed to have those. I always had kind of that vagabond, gypsy mentality in me, which carried over into my teenage and adult years. But I took my first drink at 12 or 13, got plowed, woke up the next morning with the most excruciating hangover that I've ever had, even in all the, and I remember laying in my yard and the sun was beating on my head, and it was just so intense. And all I could think about is, I can't wait till next weekend. I'm going to do this again. It was awesome. And But the problem is we moved again. We moved when the Wednesday of that week. I came home from school and my dad said, "Pack your stuff. We're hopping on a plane." And we came back. So I didn't get the opportunity the next weekend. And I only got one other opportunity between that point and like the next year. And it didn't happen until I was about 15. But once I hit about 15 or 16 years old, give or take, I was getting loaded probably 4, 5, 6 times a week. And I had a good justification for not being an alcoholic for a lot of years, is I didn't drink on Tuesdays. Because, you got to think about this. It's a Thursday. Thursday is the beginning of the weekend. So you party on the weekend. Friday's the weekend. Saturday's the weekend. Sunday's the weekend. So all those days are acceptable. And Monday's the end of the weekend. And Wednesday's hump day. So I had a legitimate reason to drink those 6 nights out of the week. I couldn't find one for Tuesday. I did later find one. I found 50-cent mug night on Tuesdays. It was all about justification, really. It's interesting. When I was first trying to get sober, there was a real big emphasis on knowing that you're an alcoholic. Knowing, you gotta know your first step, and if you relapse, you don't know your first step. And for me, I walked into the rooms. I knew I was an alcoholic. I knew I was an alcoholic from the time I was 16 years old. Me and my buddy used to joke about, how we're alcoholics because we buy a case of beer and then go to a keg party. It was like a badge of honor or rite of passage that we used to have, So knowing I was an alcoholic, truly played no part in me getting sober. I knew I was an alcoholic long before I got clean. But like I said, that life was normal to me, and I followed the pattern, of that life, and I moved out when I was I moved out the first time when I was 16, but I moved out permanently when I was 18 years old, and proceeded to drink and party on a daily basis. I didn't like the idea of having to get a job. So the electricity got turned off. The heat got turned off. The water got turned off. So what I did was I lit candles. I had a fire, and I went out to the street with the little pole and turned the water back on. And we used to cook on the little bonfire pit in the backyard. And I got party money from being the go-to guy for anybody who wanted something. I grew up in a college town. It was, and I was a local, so I knew anybody and everybody who had something, of want to college students who were partying on the weekends. And, I was that guy. And so it allowed me to party the way I wanted to and not have to have any money. I used to say, why go to work when you can party? And that logic, brought me out onto the streets. I spent years, and again, justification, why live $50,000 house? We can live under a $50 million bridge. I'm camping out of stars, Yeah, I had a great spot until they busted me. I had this little cave made out of vines, and I had a little clothesline up, and I had the radio next to my bedroll, and it was right next to the creek, so I could jump in and take a bath. And, I was a very clean cut dirtbag. I bathed on a daily basis, but, I lived outside and I did my thing. And, I sold a lot of drugs, and I stole a lot of booze. And I used to joke that, my job was to play hacky sack in the park. And that's what I did. Ultimately, I ended up getting arrested. I ended up doing some state time. And I remember when I was locked up, I wrote letters. I wanted everybody to know that I have a problem and that I need help. Because I did recognize at that point that, every time I've been arrested, it was in the pursuit of getting loaded, and I made the connection that, these external consequences have something to do with my drinking. And I wrote letters, and I knew I had a problem, and I knew I needed to do something about it. And in California, they give you $200 when you get released. So within 20 minutes of being released, I had a six-pack. Within 2 hours of being released, I had a half ounce of weed down my pants, bottle of schnapps in my back pocket, and 2 hits of acid in my system, and I hadn't seen my parole officer yet. I woke up the next morning after sleeping under a bridge and realized, oh shit, I'm exactly where I was when I started. I'm going back, and all my friends and all the people that I knew at that time were doing life on the installment plan. They'd do a year in, 6 months out, 2 years in, 3 months out, and it was this cycle. And I knew I didn't want to do that. I remember leaving jail and telling people, if you see me within the next year, you'll see me for the rest of my life. If you don't see me within the next year, you won't ever see me again. And I knew that I needed to get away. And I took a geographical cure. It worked, but it took a while. Okay. I moved to New Jersey, and my theory was I need to go where people work. Yeah. Well, because up until this point, the idea of a hard day's work was sitting on an inner tube with a keg floating behind me, that was, that's what we did. We grew pot, we cooked speed, we sold acid, and we went inner tubing with a keg floating behind us. And that was our life. And, so I had to go to the East Coast. I came to New Jersey. My mom was here. She was in Alcoholics Anonymous. And she told me that if I was going to stay with her, I couldn't get high. I think that lasted a week. But I was good. I tried really hard not to come into the house wasted. And then I tried really hard not to smoke a joint out the window. Then I tried really hard. But the thing was, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't stay away from it. I could last a day. I could last 2 days. But at some point or another, I had to get high. And, the last time, when I was with my mom, it was, the dead came to town and, well, yeah, you can visualize it. I went to the show and I woke up on the park bench in the backyard and, the landlord got me and my mom threw me out and said either you got to get out or you got to go to detox. And so, okay, I'll go to detox. My first real experience with Alcoholics Anonymous, because I'd been to NA a few years before with a buddy of mine who I was showing support for. And, I went when I was on 2 hits of acid and I found the people who smoked the pot in the backyard or in the back behind the building. But I went for support, and, but I went to detox and, I asked my mom, how long does it take? She goes, 3 to 5 days. So, after 3 days, I told my counselor, my mom said I could leave after 3. And, the one thing that struck me when I went in there was, they gave you that test. It was like 10 questions, of what makes you an alcoholic. And I answered 8 out of 10 yes. And my counselor asked me what I thought of that. And I said, well, maybe I'm a potential alcoholic. And I really believed it at that point. I really believed that, because of these 2 things that I don't do, that only qualifies me to be potential. I don't really need to stop. I spent that was probably another 3 years, 2 years of actively partying, because I wasn't getting, it's weird because, there were tremendous consequences that came along with this, but I never really viewed them as consequences because they seemed normal. Everybody that I hung out with, up until this point in my life, I don't want to say, it sounds wrong and I don't know how to articulate this right, but they were less than, in a sense. They were of a lower, they'd been there longer, I guess is the best way to put it, because I wasn't any better than them, but on the outside I did look better than them. And so I had these people that were my role models and the people that I looked to as to what was acceptable and what wasn't. And they were so far down past me, I hadn't gotten there yet, that I'm fine. I'm okay. Yeah, I'm eating out of a garbage can, but it's okay because I don't look like Ziggy over here. He's got things growing on him. So eating out of a garbage can isn't that bad. And the same thing happened when I came to New Jersey. I still hung out with people who were worse off than I was, and I was able to justify a lot of my use. But it got to a point where I was with this girl, and she had finally left me. We were supposed to get married, and she backed out, which probably one of the best things that ever happened. But I got extremely depressed. I'm in this apartment alone with these 2 cats, and I'm trying not to drink. And I'm making it through the day until about midnight. And then at midnight, I got to go to the bar. I can't make it any further. And then I'd close that bar, go to another one, and bring those people back to the house and stay up until the morning. Because I have this allergy. We were talking about this earlier. I have a craving. Once I put booze in my system, the booze tells me when to stop, or something external tells me when to stop. Either I drink until it's done, or I drink until I hit a wall. And sometimes it's figuratively the wall, and sometimes it's not. But I don't stop once I start. But the thing is even when I had moments of abstinence, I was incapable of staying away from it. Because booze was never my problem. Now, I heard this years ago, and it really clicked with me, is booze was never my problem. Booze was my solution. It did for me what I couldn't do for myself, and I couldn't function in the world without it. Um, I was a round the clock daily drinker, and I done at certain points I did that whole shake thing, but I was young. I was in my early 20s, and so I bounced back relatively quickly. I probably felt like I was 40, but I physically could handle this to a certain degree, but emotionally and mentally and spiritually, I was just wrecked. I eventually got to the point where I was on parole and my PO was going to lock me up. I got a dirty test, I got a petty theft and a drunk driving charge all in the same month. And I went to my PO and I said, I need help. I need to go to rehab or I need to go to whatever. And she sent me to this place down in New Brunswick, which is like this real hardcore TC. They shave your head and make you wear a diaper and things like that. And I know me, I know me. I'm not, you don't have razor wire and the doors aren't locked. I'm not staying in a place like that. So I called her and I said, either lock me up or give me another day. Me questioning everything right from the gate, but that's really how I felt at the time. So she gave me another day and I ended up going into the Salvation Army. And, for all its faults, the Sally did one thing for me that saved my life. I bitched and complained all the way through that place, but it did save my life. They told me you got to find God in order to get sober. I didn't buy into their brand. In fact, I fought it tooth and nail. They used to make us wear a jacket and tie to chapel, and they were telling me I had to cut my hair. I had hair down the middle of my back at the time, and and I fought it tooth and nail. I had an old tie-dye button-down shirt that I used to wear to chapel with the tie, and it was, I had to stand out somehow, and I had to say no, I'm not like you guys somehow. Yeah, and then I left the 90-day program after 89 days. Good alcoholic that I am, but I went into a halfway house, or not a halfway, yeah, it was a halfway house. It was Mount Carmel Guild in Newark. And I remember them talking about, you got to talk about your reservation. You got to talk about your reservations. And up until this point, I had never had a problem with weed. I loved my weed, but it never gave me external consequences. It never gave me any problems. I go to work when I'm stoned. I clean my house when I'm stoned. I don't go to jail when I'm stoned. And I used to talk about this and talk about this and talk about this and talk about this. And one day I went and got high. And, but I knew I had a problem with booze and I was already in AA and I have a desire not to drink. So I'm still a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, even though I'm smoking pot. It's okay. You got to think the drink through, let go and let God. And I'm smoking a bone outside the back door. I'm going to be spiritual and be a Rasta, it's here in the back. She knows. I really believe that this was okay. This is how insane my mind is. I truly believed that I could smoke dope, be spiritual, be a Rastafarian, and go to AA and still stay sober. And it lasted a few months. It did. It lasted a few months. And eventually, this little thing started messing with me. It was kind of a voice in the back of my head saying, you're full of shit, and this guilt and this hypocrisy just started to kind of creep in and just kind of really gnaw at me. And, but you know what? I didn't relapse. I was just smoking this natural herb, trying to be spiritual. So I got to go out and I got to get drunk so that I can come back. So I can officially come back. And I did. I went out and I got drunk. The problem was I couldn't come back. It took me 3 years of going to meetings every single day. 3, 4 meetings a day. And I wasn't able to put together more than a couple of days at a time. I went to 2 detoxes and got loaded within a day or hours after being released. I remember I was sober 3 days and I met Carrie. And she was, we were talking about this before earlier about prayer and medication, and she was working that kind of program. And she had a mohawk and combat boots and a hippie skirt. And, cool. I'm there in my overalls and no shoes and a tie-dye, and we fit. And everybody told us to stay away from each other. And we fit. And we ended up getting together, getting this apartment in East Orange, New Jersey, which is serious hood, and we lasted a little while. It was a couple weeks. No, it wasn't a couple weeks. What? 2 days after Pink Floyd. Okay. But we were on our way. We went down to this NA meeting down in East Orange, and if we can't find this meeting, I'm gonna go get loaded. Found this meeting. If they don't open up this meeting on time, I'm gonna just go out and get drunk. If this guy says greasy crackhead one more time, I'm gonna go get high. And he did. And so we proceeded to get drunk that night, and that was the last run, God willing, up until this, they brought me back in, and I got to try Zima, which was, but I remember, again, this is, once I start, there's no stopping. I can't stop me. Something outside of me needs to stop me. And I remember crawling out of a basement on September 6th and feeling like my brain's been run over by a truck. And walking down Kearny Avenue in Kearny, New Jersey, thinking, God, I'm here again. I'm homeless again. We lost our little apartment in East Orange because we didn't want to pay rent. My stuff is in her mom's garage, and I'm dirty, I'm stinking, I'm homeless again, and I've got this wicked hangover, and I gotta go back. I gotta go back to the rooms. And I remember walking to there was a meeting at noon in Lyndhurst, which was a few miles away, and we walked down Kearny Avenue, but we had to stop and get my wallet on the way. And I went to pick up my wallet from the guy I was with the night before. I had left it in his car, and he handed me back a bag of weed. And on instinct or whatever it was, I took it. I've been talking for the past hour about how I need to go get sober. And I'm going to a meeting, and this guy hands me this bag, and I just took it right out of his hand. I don't, it's this compulsion. It's this, I don't know how to be sober. That's what it really comes down to. That's the obsession of my mind is not so much that I can control and enjoy my drinking. That's there to some degree, or that was there years ago, but it got to the point where, no consequence matters anymore, because the uncomfortability that I'm in when I'm sober is so great that I just don't care. That I just don't care. That noise in my head and that pain inside, but fortunately, she had half a brain at that moment and got rid of it. And we walked to this meeting, and it was a big book meeting. It wasn't a big book meeting like we know big book meetings to be, but it was still a big book meeting. And I got a big book and we read the story about the Southern Belle or whatever her name was. And the scary thing about it is this is some old Southern woman and I totally got it. For that moment, I had this window where there was no comparison. It was all about tapping into the experience and the feeling. And, I jumped right in. I got a sponsor very, very quickly. The problem was my sponsor told me if I did a 4-step, I would drink. But I had a sponsor, I got a network of people that I called on a regular basis. I got involved and I was making meetings as often as possible. And I did the things that I didn't want to do before. Now, granted, the group that I got sober in didn't believe in step work. They believe that if you make enough meetings that, and you go to enough barbecues and if you hang out with the right people and cause the town of Kearney where I got sober is a very insulated community. All the meetings in the area are all within walking distance and it's every single day of the week and you can walk to a meeting and you can hide out in AA. And if you hook up with the right crowd, you can hide out in AA completely and you never have to experience anything out there. And you can run to a meeting and you can share about your problems and feel better until the next day, until you have to run to a meeting and share about your problems and feel better till the next day and so on. But me, I remember being in a meeting and feeling like a hollowed out egg, just fragile and if you touched me, I was going to shatter into a million pieces. And there was this old guy who used to go to meetings where I got sober. And this guy was like 40, 50 years sober, 2 days older than dirt and right next to God and had this cigar like this long. And this back when you could smoke in meetings and he'd light up a cigar, at this midnight meeting and talk about grabbing drunks off the street and bringing them home and reading the book to them. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I was in this kind of therapy AA. But I heard it, it was there, it got filed. And, within a very short period of time of me getting sober, it was probably within September sometime, I started to read the book. And I read in the beginning that this is the basic text of our fellowship. And that clicked. God graced me with a moment of clarity and it registered and it made sense to me. I have no idea why, but it just did. And I started to read it and I started to do the things in there that it asked me to do. And I remember my sponsor telling me to put away my notebook, cause you're going to drink if you do this 4-step. And I told him, I said, I'm drinking anyway. What is it going to hurt me? It's the only thing I haven't tried so far, and, I finished writing the garbage inventory. I mean, it was 90% lies. But it was as honest as I could have been at the time, it really was, truthfully. I brought it to him and we sat down one afternoon and I shared it with him. And it was the first time in my life that I didn't feel like the nice guy who drank a little too much or the biggest piece of shit on the planet. I found some kind of balance with who I was. I remember, I did the steps all ass backwards that first time. I started off with 10. I started looking at 10 and 11. I started looking at my day, then looking at the defects and then writing them down and then looking at them. Do I want God to remove these? Yes, I do. God, please take them away. So doing 10, 11, 6 and 7 and I'm writing 4 at the same time. And you know what? I started to get a feel for this thing, I had no guidance, but I was reaching around in the dark and I was reading the book. And like I said, it was making sense, but it wasn't, cause I still got this alcoholic brain. I still got this screwed up mind, but it was making some sense. And, that experience has always, brought me to that line in there. It says, God doesn't make too hard terms for those who seek, because you can do this all ass backwards and it can still happen. I truly believe, and it's taken me a long time to get to this place, but the methodology doesn't matter. It's the intent and the fact that I'm truly trying to seek God, and God comes in and will tap you, because he did it for me. I did my best to make all the amends that I was aware of at that time, and I completed that first round of amends. I probably was less than a year sober, probably maybe 6 months, 9 months, because I did that first inventory at 4 or 5 months, whatever it was. I started it. It took me 2 months to write it. I walked around. I had 160 names on my resentment inventory. I won't do that to newcomers anymore. I kind of, if they're okay and they're writing like that, I don't mess with them. But if they're starting to kind of stumble or act out or do whatever, I give them a time frame. You know what I mean? You know what? You can do it again in 6 months. You can do it again in a year. 160 names to write and sit in inventory really sucks. It truly, because you're miserable through that. And it's a long ass fifth step too. But like I said, I did this, and and then we moved and we met some people who had this. They had experienced this, and I learned how to read the book. The way it was, the way I learned I don't want to say the right way, because that's I don't necessarily believe it's the right way anymore, but I learned to read it the way Joe and Mark do. I got plugged into some people in Staten Island who had been sponsored by Joe or Mark or one or the other, and I had a new experience with this, and I started to do it again. But again, the gypsy in me, I moved, and I lost that connection to those people. So what we did is we started grabbing wet ones. We started grabbing the relapsers, the people with 15 years in AA but never getting sober, and bringing them back to the house and reading the book to them. And sharing this experience with them, because I went back to that area that doesn't believe in the steps, and I had nobody to bounce stuff off of. I had no sponsorship line. I had nobody to hold me accountable on any level. So what I had to do is I had to take guys through the work in order to do that, to get that aspect of my program, my fellowship. And so we started our house meeting. And that's how it began. It began out of necessity, but it evolved into something really cool. At 4 years sober, I stumbled across a group in Bernardsville, New Jersey, and I asked a guy to be my sponsor who had like 20 something years, and he'd been doing this for a long time, and he's the one who actually gave me the real meat to this book, and he showed me how to do it, quote unquote, the right way. I like I said, I've since changed my view on that, but he gave me the mechanics, and the mechanics in that book to me are very important. But what happened, and I'll quickly share my experience on it. I was raised a good Catholic. I sit, kneel, stand. I say the response. I know the prayers. I'm watching Stigmata a few years ago, and I'm saying the responses out of habit to the priest on the TV. That's the kind of, that's what I was raised with, and I became very attached to the method in that book. And the way you're supposed to do it, and the right way to do it, and dot the I's and cross the T's, and do my nightly review at this time, and wake up and have my nightly review and my prayer meditation in front of me, and I'm doing this perfect. And I got crazy. I really did. I got crazy. And I got sicker. And I'm looking at these people in my home group, and they're all seem happy and life is awesome, and I'm friggin' miserable. There's something missing. There's something wrong. And I don't, like I said, I don't blame my sponsor. I blame me for it, but he asked me when I first asked him to sponsor me, he asked me to set aside everything that I know. And what I did, well, what I should have done is I should have taken what I knew up until that point in my experience and put it on the back burner and had an open mind to go through to work with him. But instead I threw it out. I just threw it away. And what I had been doing for those first 4 years was working. There was a spirit behind what I was doing. I didn't have the mechanics from the book the way they're laid out, but I had the spirit, and I threw that spirit out, and I got this very rigid fundamentalist kind of big book message. And since had to make a lot of amends for that period of time in my life. Because I was the kind of guy I'd walk into a 12 and 12 meeting with my big book under my arm and point out where they're doing it wrong, but I threw out all the spirit, and I got the mechanics, and I went crazy. And I remember sitting in my office one night, and my wife walks in and she says, "I want a divorce." What? Totally blown away. Truly, I had no idea. In hindsight, she had told me along the way that this is going to happen, but I was totally blindsided by this, and I was clueless. And I sat down and I wrote my nightly review that night, and my sponsor came up, my wife came up, somebody from my Steel on Steel came up, and her best friend came up. I said, "Oh shit, I'm screwed." The people who were closest and most influential in my life are on my nightly review, and I hate them right now. And I decided at that point I need to do this again. I need to go through this process again. And I called up my old sponsor, the guy that told me I'd drink. He had since gone through some steps and had an experience himself, and I called him up and I was telling him what was going on. And that I'm working with all these guys, and I'm crazy, and I don't know what's going on. And I got this group of people in my living room. There's a whole bunch of them, and I can't be nuts and giving them this information. And he goes, "Well, you know what you do is bring a blank book." And I was like, "What? I can't do that. I need my teacher's guide. I need that book that's been to 40 workshops with all the right highlighters and the dates and all the facts and figures." He goes, "No, bring a blank book." And I was totally clueless. I had no idea what he was talking about, but I did it. I think it was Monday night, rolls around, and I go and I sit in this group, and we say our prayer, and I crack the book, and we agnostics or wherever we were. And I started to read from this blank book, and all of a sudden the pages came alive. And it was exactly what was going on that week. And for the next couple months or whatever it was that we were going through that run through the book, everything was about what was happening that week and from the week before to now, and how it applied and how this stuff works. And it changed my whole view. It changed my whole perspective on the 12 steps. It changed my whole view of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I had celebrated right around that time, and I remember walking up to the podium, and first things that came out of my mouth was, "This has been the worst year of my entire life. I'm so uncomfortable. I'm in so much pain. It sucks." But what? And not once in this past year have I wanted to pick up a drink. It has not crossed my mind. And that's a direct result of the 12 steps in this book and God. And I was blown away because it was real. I can be in pain today and not want to drink. And the book is alive. I just got done doing some work. That's not true. I didn't get done yet. I'm still in the middle of it. And it's new, and it's different, and it's the same deal. I don't worry about which method I'm using anymore. I pray and I ask God to show me. I have a prayer that I use every time that I sit down and write, or anytime I sit down and, do some kind of process in the book, is, "God, please show me what blocks me from you and my fellows." And that's it. And I start to write, and I let God do the work. it's been an amazing trip. It really has. And I can't imagine what's going to happen, down the road. But, if it's anything like it's been, it's a hell of a ride. It really is. But, I don't know how much that related to the first step tonight, but hey, that's okay because that's what needed to come out. And, I guess, I'll shut up and that's it. Thanks.